En we zijn live. Althans, ik ben live. Want volgens mij is het misgegaan, jongens. Want goedenavond iedereen. Ik zie het allemaal in de chat erbij komen. Dat is wel leuk. Want ik zit nou weer een keer via StreamYard. En ik zie bijvoorbeeld, inderdaad, kan ik weer de dingetjes in beeld halen. Goedenavond Peter, of is het Marcel, weet ik wel. Wappie TV, Arthur, Mamsbroek, Rob, Raymond en weet ik veel allemaal mensen. Goedenavond. Hey, ik zit eventjes met iets, want ik heb namelijk nog niet helemaal contact met de andere kant van de platte aarde. En oftewel mijn metgezel, mijn mensen met wie ik zou gaan praten vandaag, ik denk dat er iets tussen is gekomen of iets dergelijks. Sowieso is het natuurlijk zo, nou is er sowieso het een en ander aan de hand. Is het geluid goed? Ja, het geluid is wel goed, hè. Nou is er sowieso het een en ander aan de hand. Steven natuurlijk, met wie ik onder andere de vorige keer in gesprek was, die heeft helaas een beroerte gehad, geloof ik, of een soort herseninfarct. Is het? Nou ja, goed, een beroerte gehad eigenlijk. En is dus wat minder gezond geweest de afgelopen tijd. Maar het gaat wel iets beter met hem, maar hij is nog niet helemaal. Oké, het geluid is prima. Hey, ik heb nu... Hey, goedenavond, Steven. Nou, je zit in de chat inderdaad. Nou, nogmaals, alle beterschap naar jou. Ik weet niet wat er aan de hand is, man, want ik krijg even geen contact. En ik heb nog niemand in mijn chat. Althans, ik bedoelde in mijn StreamYard hier ook. Ik ga het ook dus niet... ik heb ook voor de rest niet heel veel voorbereid, behalve het gesprek dan. Althans, ik wou gewoon lekker in gesprek gaan. Maar ik ga dat niet in mijn eentje doen, want voor de rest heb ik wel het een en ander voorbereid. Maar dat is voor later. Oké, daar heb je Rene. Kijk eens even, jongens. Rene komt er nu al in, zie ik. Althans, Rene, het gaat niet helemaal lekker, zie ik. Want ik zie dat je device is not connected. Je device is not connected. Nee, is goed, Steven. Hij probeert hier al in te loggen, maar dat gaat niet helemaal goed komen. Nou, ondertussen kan ik jullie wel iets vertellen, alvast een beetje. Nou, Rene, ik denk dat je nog... Ik ga je gewoon nog een keer even eruit gooien dan. Of zo? Nee, ik weet niet. Je moet zelf maar even opnieuw inloggen en uitloggen dan of zo. Want dit gaat niet helemaal goed. Devices is not connected. Nou, ondertussen mensen kan ik je wel iets laten zien natuurlijk. Want ik heb natuurlijk wel het een en ander... Nou, wat ik gisteren onder andere achterkwam. En wat ik ook al heel vaak heb geconstateerd. Is, nou zitten al mijn kijkers vooral via YouTube. Ja, nou eigenlijk allemaal. En nou heb ik bijvoorbeeld... krijg ik dit bijvoorbeeld. Nou, wat je hier ziet is eigenlijk onder andere het overzicht, wat ik eigenlijk de afgelopen periode, een paar weken, heb gehaald aan kijkminuten dan. En dit is via een overzicht via Restream. En dan zie je staan 140.000 minuten dan en tegenover 70.000 of zo op YouTube. Maar het gekke is dat 100% van mijn kijkers zit op YouTube. Maar dat is dus 70.000, maar ik heb dus in totaal aantal views van 140.000 of zo. Dus wat is hier nou aan de hand? Ik zie dus sowieso de helft dus niet. Zowel op mijn YouTube zie ik de helft dus niet blijkbaar. En eigenlijk heb ik dus dubbel zo groot bereik. Maar dat vind ik dus vreemd. Goed, dat even daar gelaten, mensen. Ik ga heel eventjes proberen hier nou... Rene, het gaat niet helemaal lekker, zie ik. Device is nog steeds not connected, mensen. Wat ik ga gaan doen, ik ga heel eventjes kijken of ik op een andere manier contact kan zoeken. Ondertussen kan ik jullie heel eventjes iets voorschotelen, wel ongetwijfeld. Want ik zie, dit gaat niet helemaal goed volgens mij. Ik ga heel eventjes jullie nogmaals iets voorschotelen en dan ga ik heel even kijken wat ik hier aan kan doen. Mensen, 1 seconde. Wacht, 1 seconde. Ik zie dat er nu iets gaat gebeuren. Want Rene gaat nu volgens mij opnieuw in en uit loggen. En dan gaan we keihard in gesprek, mensen. Nou, wat ook wel vaag is dat dus de platte aarde content, die wordt super goed bekeken de laatste weken of zo. Dit is allemaal booming, mensen. En ook, wat ik ook wel mooi vind, ook toevallig inderdaad van de afgelopen week, van alle content die ik maak dan is juist de platte aarde dingen, wat iedereen zo belachelijk vindt, is toch wel ook het meest, weet ik, van de meeste engagement, het wordt het meest bekeken. En nou ja, wat we natuurlijk ook onder andere hebben gezien, en wat ik ook vorige keer al had voorspeld, is dat er dus diverse figuren in de alternatieve media of in de media nu slecht gaan praten natuurlijk over de platte aarde. Dat kan natuurlijk niemand geloven. Dat is natuurlijk het meest belachelijke wat je ooit hebt gehoord. Maar het mooie is dat dus juist met die platte aarde, dus dat de mensen die er dan iets over gaan zeggen, zoals we hebben die meneer Arnaert gehad, en we hebben, weet ik wel, en nog een paar anderen gehad die er zich al over hebben uitgesproken. Helaas blijft er natuurlijk niks van hun argumenten overeind, omdat you can't beat flat earth, mensen. Hey, ik zit nog steeds heel even te wachten, inderdaad, jongens. Ondertussen op de metgezellen met wie ik dus het gesprek zou voeren vandaag. En ik zit maar een beetje voor het eerst in een live chat, zegt... nou, ik ga jullie er nog bij aan. Lucia Piekerek. Voor het eerst in een live chat. Nou, Lucia, het is de eerste keer dat ik jou zie, joh. Dus ik nog net zoals dat ik een heleboel namen nog nooit heb gezien, bijvoorbeeld deze. kijken. Yvonne. Goeiedag Yvonne. Goedenavond. En ik zie trouwens ook de mensen die ik wel vaker in de chat zie natuurlijk. Zoals een Jay en zoals een Melle en een Raymond. En ja jongens, dit is allemaal het coole van StreamYard. Och, hier, dan ga ik het... Helaas Rene, het gaat niet goed komen zie ik. Device not connected, wederom. Helaas. We zien. Doe even lief. Wat zeg je nou? Doe eens lief tegen Bas. Hey, doe lief tegen Bas. Nee, Bas zie ik niet in mijn chat. Want die staat op blokkade. Net als een aantal anderen, geloof ik. Want dat zijn uiteraard al eerder gebleken keiharde trollende mensen. En die zijn met andere dingen bezig dan dit ondersteunen. Die zijn alleen maar bezig met de boel belachelijk maken. En de boel erin te luisteren, volgens mij. Stella, goedenavond. En een goedenavond ook Arno trouwens. Even zien. Als iemand tegen je wil schelden, dan doe ik het wel. Nou, ik weet niet, volgens mij zijn jullie lekker met elkaar gesprek aan het voeren. Ik volg je wel altijd maar achteraf. Nou, bij deze, leuk dat je er een keer live bij bent. Ik ben nu zelf ook maar een beetje keihard aan het improviseren. Er zitten ondertussen 75, 78, 80 mensen naar mij te kijken met mijn pan. En wat vinden jullie trouwens van mijn redacted achtergrond? Dat is toch vet, of niet? Ja, jongens, het kan allemaal. Lekker naar station Bijlmer, zegt Marcus. Trouwens, Marcus, ik zou je nog even een mail sturen trouwens. Ik zag dat je een mailtje had gestuurd, maar ik heb er niet kunnen reageren eigenlijk. Jannie, 60, goedenavond. Drone in het verzet, goedenavond. We zijn er allemaal weer klaar voor, mensen. Mocht het dan niet helemaal goed komen, dan heb ik sowieso nog wel iets alternatiefs in de planning voor jullie eventueel om te gaan bekijken nu. Maar ik heb hem al klaarstaan eventueel, mocht het niet helemaal goed komen. Tooske, goedenavond ook. Allemaal nieuwe namen voor mij, leuk. En prima, want weet je, ik heb een tijdje gehad dat ik iedereen blokkeerde, of dat ik iedereen eruit gooide. En aangezien ik ook honderden nieuwe leden erbij heb, kan ik niet iedereen eruit blijven gooien natuurlijk. Oftewel, dus in één keer, je kletst toch al 5 kwartier in een uur. Ja, nou, ik kan het inderdaad redelijk volhouden. Even zien. Plat, rond, vierkant driehoek, alles is mogelijk. Elke theorie is een optie. Nou, laten we inderdaad alle opties open houden, inderdaad, Mars. Want dat is sowieso ten eerste al een hele goede instelling om aan te houden. Gewoon, wees inderdaad gewoon lekker open-minded. Want als je dus zo blijft vechten tegen bijvoorbeeld de platte aarde, omdat het allemaal niet waar kan zijn. Ik weet ook niet precies wat er waar is. Ik ben alleen meer overtuigd, veel meer overtuigd geraakt van een platte aarde en alles wat erbij komt, als een ronde aarde dan. Wat ik natuurlijk zelf al heb ontdekt de afgelopen tijd, en waarbij ik ook geprobeerd heb sowieso met ChatGPT en al die shit, om mijn theorieën ook wetenschappelijk te onderbouwen, omdat het gewoon geen onzin is. En omdat ik er ook wel een beetje klaar mee ben dat mensen het maar als een soort wappie shit gaan wegzetten of zo, of iets wat wel achterlijk is. Want nogmaals, niemand wil verder in discussie gaan over de platte aarde bijna. En de mensen die er dan iets over zeggen, die blijven, weet ik wel, er blijft niks van over. Als ik dat op een gegeven moment tegen elkaar af ga strepen, of weet ik wel, als we de verhalen tegenover elkaar gaan zetten. Ik heb nou een grappig dingetje. Ik heb nou zoiets. Gisteren, of ik zag van de week, zag ik natuurlijk sowieso die ene achterlijke Mongool bij, hoe heet het nou, bij de Nieuwe Wereld. Die ene vieze, rare gast die ook voor de klas staat of zo, toch? Die gozer. En dus ik vond het dan al heel opvallend dat hij uitgerekend bij zo'n serieus programma als de Nieuwe Wereld zit. En ik kijk dat ook wel eens inderdaad. Daar vind ik het heel vaak ook gewoon een beetje zweverig en surfen, een beetje over de top of wat dan ook. Maar ik dacht bij mezelf, ik ga toch weer eens een poging wagen om te kijken of we wederom misschien een ingangetje kunnen hebben om een groter podium te creëren voor inderdaad dan de platte aarde. Dus ik heb dus een hele serieuze e-mail geschreven naar de Nieuwe Wereld gisteravond. Met dus inderdaad een linkje naar mijn papers en naar mijn, weet ik wel, naar mijn boekpresentaties. Weet ik veel, alles wat ik over de platte aarde te zeggen heb op een serieuze manier en wetenschappelijk onderbouwd. En dan ben ik heel benieuwd of die mensen dus gaan reageren. Als er namelijk die gekke gozer, die achterlijke Mongool, die rare, weet ik veel, dierensekslover die voor de klas wil staan, als ze dus die wel ook een podium geven en hem serieus aan het woord laten, dacht ik bij mezelf, nou, dan zijn jullie ook vast wel bereid om een keer serieus in gesprek te gaan over zoiets geks als de platte aarde dan. Want nogmaals, er blijft niks van niemand hun argumenten over als we letterlijk die discussie eens gaan voeren. En nou wil ik ook zeker niet claimen dat ik dan het ultieme gelijk heb, maar ik weet wel dat hetgeen wat wij allemaal als de wetenschap of als de waarheid, weet ik wel, voorgespiegeld krijgen, dat is sowieso onzin. En dat is gewoon keihard aan te tonen. En ik wil niet zeggen, ik zeg altijd space is fake. Ik weet niet dat de ruimte is, of wat ik me daarbij moet voorstellen. Ik weet alleen wel dat hetgeen wat ons verteld wordt, dat het dan is, dat is fucking onzin. Even zien. Piloten weten dat het inderdaad een platte aarde is. Nou, inderdaad, sowieso. Dat is ook, dat zie je dus inderdaad bij heel veel filmpjes van piloten, zie je dat terug. En nou is het ook zo dat de kaarten die gasten aanhouden, hè, dus de vliegmap, weet ik veel wat, dat is natuurlijk sowieso, het is al tientallen jaren dat een bepaalde layout, dat is weer diezelfde layout als dat je ziet bij de VN, de vlag, weet ik veel wat, of is het de United Nations en al die shit, toch? Oftewel, de layout van de platte aarde, zoals die dan wordt gepresenteerd, dat is inderdaad de juiste weergave. Volg een chemtrail, bijvoorbeeld 10 minuten vliegtuig, vliegt 800 km per uur, 30 km per minuut, dus 10 minuten om de ronde van aarde. Ja, goed, nou, sowieso heb ik gisteren natuurlijk al met mijn chatgesprekken achterhaald. Dus dat je dus dat ze dus bijvoorbeeld met het rekenen of het berekenen van de lichtsnelheid, dat ze dus destijds een soort proef hebben gedaan, 1800 nog wat of zo, waar dat dus blijkt. Dus dat uiteindelijk, als je dus die kromming van de aarde gaat berekenen, dat was over een afstand van 38 kilometer of 35 kilometer of zo. En daarmee hadden ze dan berekend wat de lichtsnelheid was. Maar toen heb ik dus, het was dan gemeten vanaf een heel klein huis, ergens op een Naval Academy, wat dan ook. En het bleek dus uiteindelijk, dus moest je ook toegeven, dat volgens de officiële berekeningen, over een afstand van 35 kilometer, wat dan ook, dan is er dus een kromming van 110 meter. En was het gebouw dus minimaal 110 meter hoog, willen ze dus in staat überhaupt zijn geweest om dus die meting te kunnen doen, of die berekening te kunnen maken. Nou, heel bijzonder. Uiteindelijk kon dus ook zelfs dus de wetenschappelijke ChatGPT-4 kon niets anders toegeven. Dat inderdaad het gebouw wel 110 meter hoog moest zijn. De grootste onzin natuurlijk. Hey, even zien. Zou je er bij dit even naar 10 keer zo snel moeten draaien? Nou, sowieso, weet je, dat soort dingen, het draaien van de aarde en al die onzin inderdaad, dat is zo keihard makkelijk te ontkrachten. En nogmaals, ik wil ook niet dat het onzin blijft. Ik heb dit ook echt de afgelopen tijd echt op een zo wetenschappelijk mogelijke manier willen beschrijven. Nou is het ook zo dus dat ik dus allerlei onderzoeken daarin weet ik veel, heb opgespoord, wat ik in al die Flat Earth video's terugvind, weet je wel, al die gekke onderzoeken die er over dan wordt gesproken. En nou is het ook zo dus dat ik heb het goed, en die onderzoekjes daar wordt gesproken, ja, 1 seconde. 1 seconde, want even zien. Heb je het YouTube-kanaal van de Tomb of Illumination gezien? Super interessant of Platte Aarde nu inzichten. Nou, ik ken dat niet, nee. De aarde is niet plat, zegt Johan Hermans. Nee, de aarde is een bol. Weet je het zeker, man? Even zien. Is de maan ook plat? Nou, ik denk dat... Is de maan ook plat? Ik denk dat de maan niet in ieder geval een bolletje is in de ruimte die dus het zonlicht reflecteert en dat op ons afstraalt of zo. Ik denk sowieso, dat kunnen we ook allemaal vaststellen en meten, dat de maan is een eigen op zichzelf staande lichtbron en geeft een koud licht in plaats van het warme licht wat de zon dan geeft, of genereert dan zeg maar. Want ik wil ook nog wel geloven, het zijn sowieso elektromagnetische fenomenen, zowel de zon als de maan. En zou er ook nog zoiets kunnen bestaan als dat zowel de zon als de maan van zichzelf niet eens heet zijn of warmte uitstralen, maar het is meer eigenlijk de elektromagnetische straling die dus voor ons wordt ervaren, of door ons wordt ervaren als hitte of warmte of weet ik veel wat, of koude. Sowieso, het is bijzondere shit wat je allemaal... of alles is plat, of niks is plat. Nou, dat is niet helemaal waar, man, want dat slaat nog nergens op. Dus omdat ik dus zogenaamd bolletjes om me heen zie, of zogenaamd, of sterretjes, dat is dus, betekent dat wij dan ook op een bol moeten leven. Het slaat nergens op. Onze aarde kan prima plat zijn en alles in de ruimte een bol. Of we kunnen inderdaad alles in de ruimte gewoon als een reflectie zien of wat dan ook. Simpeler kan het niet. De aarde, nou, ik weet het niet, man. Wat weet is, het kan juist nog veel simpeler. Want ga maar eens inderdaad de echte metingen naast elkaar leggen dan. Volgens mij is er nog nooit een kromming gemeten. Volgens mij is er nog nooit op de maan, is men op de maan geweest. En dat kan ik je trouwens wel eventjes beter uitleggen, of beter laten uitleggen. En dat ga ik nu ook lekker doen. Hier ga ik er even in toevoegen, mensen. Want hier is dus wat ik eigenlijk vanavond wil uitzenden, maar dat vind ik nou wel een goeie. Als je het toch niet gelooft, of als je nog echt moeite hebt om te accepteren dat we in de maling worden genomen, dat de ruimte niet bestaat, dat de maan iets anders is als wat ons wordt verteld, en dat je er helemaal niet op kan wandelen. En weet ik veel, alles waarbij je droom van de realiteit kapot wordt gemaakt, want het worden zo genaaid, mensen. Hier een zeer veelzeggende documentaire hierover.
But romanticized nostalgia is not the main reason that people cling so tenaciously, often even angrily, to what is essentially the adult version of Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy. What primarily motivates them is fear, but it is not the lie itself that scares people. It is what the lie says about the world around us and how it really functions. For if NASA was able to pull off such an outrageous hoax before the entire world and then keep that lie in place for 4 decades, what does that say about the control of the information we receive? What does that say about the media and the scientific community and the educational community and all the other institutions we depend on to tell us the truth? What does that say about the very nature of the world we live in? This is what scares the hell out of people and prevents them from even considering the possibility that they could have been so thoroughly duped. It's not being lied to about the moon landings that people have a problem with. It is the realization that comes with that revelation. If they could lie about that, they could lie about anything. Dave McGowan, Wagging the Moon Doggy. Thank you, everyone, for allowing me to speak today on the phony moon landings and space fakery. Now, I've put out quite a few videos on the moon landings hoax and space fakery, presenting a myriad of proofs, evincing that we've been lied to about pretty much everything related to space. If you are on the fence, I hope that I may present enough evidence here today that you'll go out and conduct your own investigation. At the very least, I can maybe point you in the right direction. I find it interesting how our affinity with space has become so strong that I would dare say that people love space, and that love is so blinding that they will deliberately not face the obvious adultery taking place behind their backs. I don't understand the willfully blind person. Hey man, I have pictures proving that she's lying and cheating on you. I don't want to see that. Get away from me. She'd never do that. Our love is too strong. I can't compete with that level of indoctrinated space love. No one has ever been to space, but the media has molded humanity into a society of myopic space lovers who will defend space's honor to their dying breath. I guess it's pretty pathetic. Hopefully, we can break your love affair with space. It's not a question about how much proof we have evincing that Apollo missions in space are fake. The real question is whether you will look. Here is one of the earliest attempts at faking space. The flight was in 1962, and yes, this was passed off as legitimate footage. We already know that these high-altitude balloons are the closest that we're ever going to get to space. But I do find it interesting how we were supposedly taking astronauts into these craft as early as 1962. But this part is the best. Here's the so-called footage from space. Let's look at that one more time. you know there's some shill liar out there somewhere trying to defend this footage. It's refraction that made the star appear through the moon. And that's why the footage looks like it was taken from the Twilight Zone television show. Obviously, the level of fakery has gotten much better since the 1960s, but mistakes are still being made. The proof isn't what NASA got right. The proof is what NASA got wrong. Because if NASA faked any of it, then we rightfully should assume that NASA faked all of it. NASA is a criminal organization. Every one of its executives should be thrown in slave labor camps until they pay back all of the money they stole under false pretense from the American taxpayer. Let's begin with the laughable Apollo moon missions. I don't believe there's a single genuine person who has diligently looked into the moon landings hoax evidence and still believed in the Apollo missions. The moon landings are patently ridiculous. You just need to be able to set aside your indoctrination and spend some time researching it with a skeptical but open mind. For goodness sakes, the last time man was allegedly on the moon was December 14th, 1972. It has been nearly 47 years since man was supposedly on the moon using only 1960s technology, which astronaut Donald Pettit says NASA destroyed.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
That fact alone says they lied and shifts the burden of proof to NASA. There is no plausible excuse. NASA steals $59.7 million per day from the American taxpayer. They certainly have enough money to repeat what was already done back in 1969. Oh yeah, I forgot what Don Pettit said. That amazing technology was destroyed. Back in February 2001, there was a special on Fox that was called Conspiracy Theory: Did We Land on the Moon? I watched that show when it aired, and I thought the Fox show raised some excellent points. However, a couple years later, I came across a debunking article by Phil Plait on the website Bad Astronomy. This article is still cited as the creme de la creme of debunking articles. I read through it all and became convinced that there was an answer to all of those conspiracy allegations. At least that's what I hoped. At that time, Phil Plait was my hero. He saved me from the crazy moon landing conspiracy theorists. From that time, we saw many other so-called debunking experts rise up, like the Mythbusters, Snopes.com, Metabunk, Popular Science, and many more. I mean, who can doubt the sincerity of the Mythbusters, Jamie and Adam, right? Damn liars. But let me get back to my story. For several years, I was one of those pompous people who scoffed at moon landing deniers because I read that article from Phil Plait. Then one day, another lawyer recommended that I read a series of articles on the fossil fuel hoax written by a Dave McGowan. I actually don't know if you can still read those articles, but what McGowan wrote made absolute sense, that there is no such thing as a fossil fuel. It is an utter hoax. We could devote a whole conference to that subject. But then I changed my life forever, because I clicked on another article by Dave McGowan titled, Wagging the Moon Doggy. David tragically died a few years ago from cancer, but I hope his work will be remembered for 100 years. That is, if it can survive the coming internet purge. I highly recommend you read the entire Wagging the Moon Doggy series while you still can. And if you prefer, I have the full narration on my YouTube channel. You can ignore everything I say here, but please, go read the Wagging the Moon Doggy series because it is awesome. I'm going to cover many of the points made by David McGowan, but I can't compete with his humor. Even though he believed in space, McGowan was brilliant. But above all else, David introduced me to these two laughable Apollo photographs that destroyed the NASA moon landings forever for me. I certainly didn't see these photographs on Phil Plait's website or on the Mythbusters. This here is the official lunar lander. When I usually show this to people, they automatically think it's a joke. No, seriously, this is an official photograph of the Apollo lunar lander, and you have to be a damn idiot if you don't see how ridiculous this is. Fortunately, they took a close-up photograph as well. Curtain rods, aluminum foil, tar paper, scotch tape, some useless abstract art sculptures that do nothing but look spacey, and some very poor construction. Look at the paneling. It's a disaster. If someone sheetrocked your basement like this, you'd demand your money back. But this is supposed to be an amazing spaceship constructed by the best engineers and scientists. It's absolute garbage. A shameful prop made by a high school drama club. Looking at the photographs side by side, it's unbelievable to me that they got away with this for so long. Are academics, scientists, and engineers so institutionalized that they can't see how absurd this is? It's incredibly stupid. I'm sorry, but this is not a spaceship, so this brings me to proof number 1, the lunar lander joke. There are so many problems that this entire presentation could be on the lunar lander. The first huge problem I want to discuss about the lunar lander is the fact that it was never flown on Earth. Not even once. Please go and try to find a video of astronauts getting some flight time in this piece of junk. Just think about it. This drama prop was never even allegedly flown by an astronaut on Earth in front of a camera. In fact, besides NASA's alleged dubious pictures in space, there is zero proof that this alleged vehicle could actually fly. This comical contraption, after traveling 234,000 miles in space, supposedly fell from lunar orbit at 4,000 miles per hour, and this difficult maneuver was never practiced. The lunar lander landed in poor visibility on very rough, crater and boulder-infested terrain that was all the same Portland cement color. Just imagine how easy it would have been to hit a boulder or fall into a crater when you only have these small windows flying over terrain that all looks like Portland cement. This difficult type of landing was never practiced. The lunar lander ascent stage then supposedly blasted off the moon, again achieving 4,000 miles per hour to rendezvous up in space with a spaceship that had been orbiting the moon dozens of times. Again, this maneuver was never practiced on Earth. Here is Armstrong flying one of the much smaller so-called training vehicles in optimal conditions. In this vehicle, he has full visibility and there is no rough terrain. The accident almost killed Armstrong, but he wasn't alone. 3 of the 5 training vehicles crashed, and the training vehicles were much smaller, had much better visibility, were flown in optimal conditions, over runways, in daylight, were never flown in situations similar to what would be experienced on the moon, and still, 3/5 of the training vehicles crashed. That is not a good safety record, and these were far simpler craft. Notice that the conditions the training vehicle was flying over were nowhere near what would happen on the moon. It's flying over an airfield. You'd think that NASA would want its astronauts trained to fly in low visibility over rough, rocky terrain so that its astronauts would have practice not hitting a boulder or falling down a crater. Yet, NASA didn't find it prudent to have the astronauts actually practice flying the lunar lander on Earth. No reasonable, prudent person would consider this a safe way of landing on the moon. Could you imagine what would have happened if Apollo 11 crashed its untested lander and the astronauts all died a horrible death, and the public found out that NASA never actually had the astronauts practice flying the lunar lander multiple times on Earth? NASA would have been defunded forever, and its managers would have probably gone to prison. There's simply no way that NASA would have taken such a risk, and there was only one way NASA was guaranteed 100% success, and that is by faking it. Next, they want you to believe that this piece of junk could support life up to 3 days on the moon. What kind of life support would be necessary? What kind of air conditioning would be necessary in the harshest environment imaginable? The temperature on the moon allegedly varies from negative 387 Fahrenheit at night to 253 Fahrenheit during the day. The Apollo 17 astronauts supposedly re-entered the lunar lander on 3 occasions after even driving around in a dune buggy. What kind of dust-absorbing system did it have? Where were the batteries to give it power for 3 days? How much oxygen did it have to repressurize on each occasion and last for 3 days? How was there so much room in the lunar lander that NASA was able to attach a dune buggy on later missions? Did NASA have the foresight to leave a large trunk for a fold-up dune buggy with tires and large 1970 batteries? What about all of the bulky experiments? Where did they fit? The lunacy of the lunar lander should be enough to convince any thinking person that the moon landings were fake. But we can't stop now. Exhibit 2. Kubrick's Apollo 11 lunar docking footage. So, after the astronauts were able to play around on the moon up to 3 days, the astronauts had to hop back into the ascent stage of the lunar lander and blast off the moon and catch up with the command module that had been orbiting at 4,000 miles per hour up to 3 days. Fortunately, the NASA astronauts knew exactly where the command module was after it had supposedly traveled 768,000 miles. It's also important to note that not one person on Earth was able to film this command module orbiting the moon with a telescope. You can supposedly see dark craters on the moon that are only 1 kilometer in diameter, but you can't see a large chrome spacecraft that would be reflecting sunlight like a mirror orbiting the moon dozens of times. There should be dozens of amateur astronomy videos showing the command module orbiting the moon, but they don't exist. But I especially love this Apollo 11 redocking footage. This is absolutely ridiculous. These are 1960s special effects and are obviously fake to even a child. Look at the jerky motions. Look at the total lack of thrusters being used. I've had many people ask me if this is genuine NASA footage, and yes, it is. I actually feel pretty bad for you if you believe that's a spaceship that just blasted off from the moon traveling at 4,000 miles per hour. Maybe you noticed that the video footage of the docking lunar lander appears eerily similar and as fake as Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. Exhibit 3. The preposterous Apollo ascent stage. The last video was shockingly ridiculous. Again, it's unbelievable that anyone with a brain, let alone a degree, believes that was a real spaceship traveling at 4,000 miles per hour docking in lunar orbit. Institutionalized conformity is amazingly powerful, as even individuals with a PhD won't allow themselves to question their institutions. But this gets even better. This is official NASA footage of the Apollo 15 and 17 ascent stages. Remember, the engine was never even allegedly turned on beforehand. In addition to the preposterous and obviously fake footage, NASA claims that it used a remote control to operate the camera on the moon buggy left behind, and then beamed that video footage back to Earth 234,000 miles away. We didn't even have decent television remote controls in 1972, but NASA could not only operate the camera from 234,000 miles, NASA could also pan up and follow the lunar ascent stage and zoom out all in real time without delay. Look again, the camera zooms out and pans up in real time, and this remote control was supposedly 234,000 miles away. That, ladies and gentlemen, is impossible. Does anyone here actually think this looks real? One other thing, notice that there is no thrust from the nozzle. Yes, there should have been a huge flame and obvious light source from the nozzle. Exhibit 4. No blast crater and no scorching. This is a 7,500 pound thruster. Look at its power. Look at its heat. Look at the light it creates. Look at the dust it kicks up. And yes, the Apollo astronauts claim that its lunar lander also kicked up dust, and the phony footage shows the same. The Apollo lunar lander had a bigger thruster at 10,000 pounds. Obviously, the 10,000 pound thruster failed to displace or scorch any of the lunar soil. In one case, you can see the nozzle is actually bent as it collapsed on the surface. The nozzle is literally buried in the ground, and still it did not affect the lunar soil. It's very clear a crane sat this lunar lander down on the soil. There was no rocket. Exhibit 5. The marionette astronauts. I already touched on this in my last video, but the evidence is compelling. The astronauts were dangling from wires, and you can see it multiple times. This video proves that the astronauts did dangle by wires. There really isn't much more to say then. How in the world do you believe in this nonsense? Exhibit 6. The unmistakable Apollo movie backdrop. You can clearly see the use of 1960s movie artificial backdrops here, obvious. The backdrop lines are visible throughout all the missions. In this case, you can even see the carpet used to blend in with the backdrop. No reasonable person can deny that these are movie backdrops. This was not filmed on the moon. Exhibit 7. Thousands of studio quality photos. Our NASA actors were able to impossibly produce thousands of studio quality photos. What's wrong about that? It is the fact that the astronauts did not have the ability to use the viewfinder to frame their shots, or to manually adjust aperture, focus, or shutter speed, and do so all without the benefit of secondary light sources. But the astronauts managed to do this nearly every time. This can't happen in real life. Here's how McGowan put it, skipping ahead 2 sentences. Simply stated, it would not have been possible to capture any of the images allegedly shot on the moon in the manner that NASA says they were captured. Back in the day, you see, and the younger readers may again want to cover their eyes, cameras weren't all that smart, so everything had to be done manually. The photographer had to manually focus each shot by peering through the viewfinder and rotating the lens until the scene came into focus. The proper aperture and shutter speeds had to be manually selected for each shot as well to ensure a proper exposure. That required peering through the viewfinder as well to meter the shot. Finally, each shot had to be properly composed and framed, which obviously also required looking through the viewfinder. The problem for the astronauts is that the cameras were mounted to their chests, which made it impossible to see through the viewfinder to meter, frame, and focus the shots. Everything, therefore, was pretty much of a guess. Focusing would have been entirely guesswork, as would the framing of each shot. An experienced photographer can accurately estimate the exposure settings, but the astronauts lacked such experience, and they were also handicapped by the fact that they were viewing the scenes through heavily tinted visors, which meant that what they were seeing was not what the camera was seeing. To add to their troubles, they were wearing space helmets that seriously restricted their field of vision, along with the enormously bulky pressurized gloves that severely limited their manual dexterity. The odds then of getting even one of the three elements, exposure, focus, and framing, correct under those conditions on any given shot would have been exceedingly low. And yet, amazingly enough, on the overwhelming majority of the photos, they got all three right. The fact that NASA astronauts took 5,771 photos is another major issue as well. Here's how one commenter put it. NASA wants the world to believe that 5,771 photographs were taken in the combined time of 4,834 minutes over an alleged 6 missions. This equates to Apollo 11, 1 photo every 15 seconds, Apollo 12, 1 photo every 27 seconds, Apollo 14, 1 photo every 62 seconds, Apollo 15, 1 photo every 44 seconds, Apollo 16, 1 photo every 29 seconds, Apollo 17, 1 photo every 26 seconds. Given all the facts, was it possible for two men to take that many photos in so short a time? Any professional photographer will tell you it cannot be done. Virtually every photo was a different scene or in a different place, requiring travel. As much as 30 miles travel was required to reach some of the photo sites. Extra care had to be taken shooting some stereo pairs and panoramas. Each perfectly exposed and perfectly framed picture was taken on a chest-mounted camera without a viewfinder, using manual camera settings with no automatic metering, while wearing a bulky spacesuit and stiff, clumsy gloves. The agency wants the world to believe that 5,771 perfectly exposed and perfectly framed photographs were taken in 4,834 minutes. If nothing but photography had been done, such a feat is clearly impossible, made even more so by all the documented activities of the astronauts. Imagine 1.19 photos every minute that men were on the moon. That's one picture every 50 seconds. The secret NASA tried to hide has been discovered. The quantity of photos purporting to record the Apollo lunar EVAs could not have been taken on the moon in such an impossible time frame. Exhibit 8. The Liars Press Conference. One of NASA's biggest blunders in 1969 was the fact that it didn't hire very good actors. On August 12, 1969, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin attended their first major press conference. This is the first big conference of the Apollo 11 astronauts, and it was only 2 days after the astronauts were released from quarantine. Their faces tell it all. They are not happy with what they are doing. They look like they were being forced to tell a lie, and they showed no excitement that would accompany 3 men who walked on the moon. But the funniest part to me is when one of the reporters asked whether they could see stars while on the surface of the moon. Armstrong said that he couldn't recall seeing stars, and then Michael Collins added that he didn't remember seeing any. You can see Armstrong was bothered by Collins's answer. Collins's answer is hilarious because Michael Collins was never on the surface, and so he had no reason to answer the question. In addition, Michael Collins was the pilot of the command module, and he would have allegedly seen the most amazing show of stars on the dark side of the moon, better than any person that had lived up till that time. Michael Collins supposedly saw the dark side of the moon 27 times, and he doesn't remember seeing any stars. Exhibit 9. The ridiculous lunar rover. First, how in the world did NASA plan for a fold-up dune buggy to attach only on the later Apollo flights? The lunar rover was only used on Apollo 15, 16, and 17. Are we to believe that NASA left a big trunk for a fold-up dune buggy in the designs of the lunar lander? It had wheels, it had batteries, it had seats, a satellite dish, and other components in addition to the frame. That's not something that you fit in your luggage. Next, the fold-up dune buggy was on one side of the craft. Was it not a concern for NASA to test fly the lunar lander with extra weight on one side of the craft? Of course, NASA never thought it necessary to perform even one test flight. Next, there was no scientific purpose of the lunar rover other than it looked neat for the movie cameras. This is another instance where you need to apply some common sense. By introducing a moon buggy, which had no scientific purpose, NASA was taking the unreasonable and reckless risk that one of its astronauts would get injured, jostled, cause a malfunction in one of the packs, or break down. How easy would it have been for an astronaut to hit a rock and cause a part of his suit to malfunction, or for the astronaut to get thrown from the vehicle? What if the vehicle broke down after hitting a rock covered in dust? This wasn't a minor risk, as is clearly seen in the photographs. The astronauts had poor visibility and were cruising around in conditions like these, where even the smallest problem could kill the astronaut. There's simply no way that the reckless lunar rover would have happened. What's even more funny about the lunar rover is the fact that it really looks like it was just a remote-controlled car with an action figure. The astronaut never moves from his uncomfortable position. But even more damning is the fact that many times the rover didn't produce tracks, or produce tracks in strange ways. Here is a sampling of photographs of the strange and missing rover tracks. Exhibit 10. Proof of secondary light sources. Of course, NASA could have easily filmed the Apollo movies with just one light source, but NASA needed those thousands of studio quality photos, and so NASA did use other light sources. Mythbusters tried to deceive its audience by busting this photograph by using a grainy, darkened version, and still failed to create the lighted astronaut as depicted in the demonstration. I changed out the darkened NASA photo used by Mythbusters and replaced it with the NASA original. Do you see the huge difference? Now, compare the original NASA photo with the Mythbusters version. Mythbusters certainly did not bust this argument whatsoever, and Mythbusters lied about it. But what's more telling is what Mythbusters ignored, and that's this photograph. This one photograph proves the entire Apollo mission's faults, as it is 100% impossible for that astronaut to be lit up like that on the shaded side of the lunar lander without additional light sources. Exhibit 11. The tinfoil thing. According to McGowan, another curious fact that first on the moon made note of was that, according to Harold Loden, Apollo 11 mission controller, the skin on the crew cabin of the lunar module was very thin, and that was all done because of weight savings. Another talking head added that if you really took your finger and poked hard at it, you could poke right through the outer skin of the spacecraft. It was about the thickness of 2 layers of aluminum foil. Project manager Thomas Kelly concurred, noting that the skin, the aluminum alloy skin of the crew compartment, was about 12 1/1000ths of an inch thick. That's equivalent to about 3 layers of Reynolds wrap that you would use in your kitchen. Astronaut Lavelle stated, "Whenever I saw a model of the lunar module, it had these rigid sides, and it really looked strong. Turns out that external portions of the lunar module are made up of mylar and cellophane, and it's put together with scotch tape and staples. We'd had to have pads on the floor, because if you dropped a screwdriver, it would go right through the floor." And astronauts lived in this for days with multiple repressurizations, and merely dropping a screwdriver would kill them. As pointed out by David McGowan, the lunar lander actually failed the Grumman pressure test, which blew out a window, and no one seemed to care as no design changes were ever made. Come on. Exhibit 12. The inverse square law of light. I think it was maybe Jeranism or Globebusters or both who first mentioned this, but this is a terrific proof of the fake moon landings, and it deals with how much illumination there would have been on the lunar surface according to the heliocentric model. The inverse square law describes the intensity of light at different distances from a light source. Every light source is different, but the intensity changes in the same way, meaning this is a law for all light sources. The intensity of light is inversely proportional to the square of the distance. This means that as the distance from a light source increases, the intensity of light is equal to a value multiplied by 1 divided by d squared. Here are the simple equations. As an example, if you place a 100 lumen bulb in a floodlight that shines on only 1 square meter of surface, that surface will be lit at 100 lux. However, if you back the floodlight away to shine on 4 square meters, the surface is now lit with 25 lux. The full moon, which is supposed to be reflecting sunlight, has an illuminance up to 1 lux on the Earth's surface. That's not substantial, but a full moon has enough illuminance to read from it here on Earth. It is allegedly 376,285 kilometers to the moon, from Earth's surface to moon surface. Let's assume our Apollo astronaut is 0.01 kilometers, or 1 meter, above the surface of the moon. We now plug the numbers into our inverse square law equation to find the intensity of the moonlight at the surface, solving for intensity at distance 2. I have the numbers on the printout, but you can see for yourself the problem. Sunlight has an illuminance up to 128,000 lux on Earth. That's pretty bright. That's as bright as it gets. Assuming my math and figures are right, applying the inverse square law, the Apollo astronauts would have experienced 1,106,175,009,570 times more illuminance on the moon's surface than direct sunlight on Earth. Essentially, based on the inverse square law, at the moon's surface, the light would have been the most blinding light imaginable, and there should have been no photographs possible on the lunar surface. This proves, based on physical laws, without a doubt, that there were no Apollo moon landings. One of the most common objections to the fake moon landings argument is that NASA has hundreds of supposed moon rocks. Of course, no one knows where these rocks are, and no one is allowed to actually independently investigate these moon rocks, but NASA itself destroyed this biggest proof of theirs when it gave one of its so-called moon rocks to a Dutch museum that actually analyzed the rock. As it turns out, the Dutch were given a glorious piece of petrified wood that most certainly didn't come from the moon. When one rock is proven fake, then we, the people, must rightfully assume that the rest of these alleged rocks are also fake. Building on the fact that you can see the 1960s movie backdrops repeatedly during the Apollo missions, we run into another problem. NASA reused same backdrops for different locations. Here's a good example. Another point that isn't discussed much, but I think it is a real issue for anyone who has been on a 12-hour flight, you know what I'm talking about. It is the human impossibility of sitting in a confined space for 12 days straight. Astronaut Ronald Evans on Apollo 17 supposedly sat like this for 12 days and 13 hours. I don't think that's humanly possible, and no one discussed this extreme torture. Once we agree that they faked the moon landings, and you have to be suffering from a major case of cognitive dissonance not to see that NASA did indeed fake it all, the next question I like to ask is, what are the reasonable implications of the fake moon landings? Here are my 10 implications. First, NASA has perpetrated a tremendous fraud on the world and cannot be trusted. All NASA missions should be presumed fraudulent unless proven otherwise with overwhelming evidence. Second, There will not be a Mars landing anytime soon, and it is right to assume that there is no rover on Mars or even satellite probes being sent throughout the solar system with obvious fake CGI images of space and the planets. Third, all first and second world countries failed to reveal the big Apollo lies and are controlled in some manner. All other landings by China, Japan, Russia, etc. are also likely fraudulent. Fourth, there was no big space race between the Americans and the Russians. It was fake. There was no benign reason to allegedly beat the Russians to the moon by faking the Apollo missions. The Russians were in on the deception, as evidenced by Luna 16. And if you don't know what Luna 16 was, here it is. I always have to laugh at the giant penis. You can't unsee that. Sorry. Fifth, the media cannot be trusted, as the media incessantly praises and repeats the patent lies of NASA, continually reinforces the fraudulent moon landings, and derogatorily labels anyone who rightfully thinks otherwise a conspiracy theorist. Sixth, universities, professors, astrophysicists, engineers, major churches, police organizations, the FBI, the courts, WikiLeaks, politicians, etc. all failed to uncover the obviously faked moon landings. They are controlled, directly or indirectly through conformity. Humanity cannot put their trust in these pseudo-scientists and mainstream institutions. Seventh, SpaceX and every other mainstream source has failed to reveal the fake moon landings. SpaceX receives substantial funding from NASA. SpaceX even speaks of a future Mars mission. SpaceX is also likely fraudulent. Eighth, there were no pictures of the Earth taken from space during the Apollo missions, including the famous 1972 Apollo, the Blue Marble photograph. Ninth, governments and their lying lackeys and shills can get away with big effing lies. Finally, every thinking independent person should now question all government and academic claims of space, the nature of the universe, the solar system, satellites, the Hubble telescope, the space shuttle, the ISS, and even the fundamental shape of the Earth. Skepticism is the only reasonable position, not conformity.
Ja, mijn twee. Nee. Hallo? Even 1 seconde, mensen. Volgens mij is het nu klaar. Gaat die weg, toch? Weg. Remove van de studio, ja. Hey jongens, ik laat het hierbij. Helaas is het niet gelukt voor Rene om in te loggen. Dat gaan we een andere keer weer voortzetten. En dan gaan we het jullie uiteraard weer vermaken met al onze Flat Earth praatjes. Voor de rest, ik heb je natuurlijk misschien even kunnen verbazen wat er allemaal in de chat gebeurt. Ik zie de helft niet, omdat ik de helft geblokkeerd heb. Maar blijkbaar vinden die mensen het nog steeds nodig om heerlijk te trollen in mijn chat. Maar be my guest, jongens, want zonder haters besta je niet. Ik wil voor nu jullie bedanken voor het kijken. Vanavond om 11 uur is er nog een... ga ik eventjes sowieso, heb ik een muziek live klaarstaan. Die zal ik eventjes even in de tijd verplaatsen. Niet dat jullie ernaar gaan kijken, maar dat maakt verder niet uit. Ik wil voor nu nogmaals bedankt voor het kijken. En tot de volgende keer, mensen. Ik ga lekker iets anders doen. De mazzel.